Tribal fighting had been spreading in many parts of the Congo. Brother Muhune was our local church elder in one of these areas where tribal fighting had been quite severe. His assignment had been right on the border of two of these tribal areas. He told his wife that he was going over to a nearby village to visit some of the Christians in his congregation. We don't have too many details about what happened in between that point and the experience that I want to relate. The dear mother told me about 3 weeks after the experience took place that when her husband told her that he was going over to this nearby village, that was the last time she saw him alive. His body was carried over to the headquarters of the district where the mother and her 5 children were. It was brought over by a band of these tribal fighters that had apparently caught him between his home, the district headquarters, and the village to which he had gone. They brought him over, and of course, as soon as these people in the village where the district leader lived recognized that these were enemy, they were the terrorists, everybody fled. The mother and her 5 children were in their home and were surprised when there, the back door, they threw her dead husband. These two tribes have a historical background of being enemies. Way back, as far as any written history goes, the Baluba and the Bahemba are avowed, sworn enemies. These soldiers, fighters that had come in, called the mother, tied her up, put her down in the back of her house, told her to call her children. The 5 of them were available. The 5 children were forced to come. And then what happened after that, we don't really like to talk about. But I think it's important that we realize what happens to a man's soul when he has absolutely no trace of God within it. When these men, out of political anger, tribal animosity, and such a background of hatred, let the devil take over in their lives, they will do anything. Please brace yourself for just a few moments and I will tell you what happened, although it is with a certain amount of reluctance. There in front of this dear mother who had been tied, her arms behind her, her legs tied, they made her sit there while they even further mutilated her dear husband's corpse. Then, on the little fire in which the mother had had some water boiling, these servants of the devil cut off certain portions of the man's body, boiled them, and forced the mother and children to eat parts of their father. How far can man go? Are there degrees? It would seem like it sometimes, yet perhaps there are not. Once you leave Jesus, once you say, like the fool says, there is no God, or you perhaps are not quite definite and you merely have doubts and question his existence, anything could happen. You lose all sense of proportion, of values, and of life itself. The leader of this group of fighters that had come across the river into this tribal area and had done perhaps one of the worst atrocities. There were many. The leader was a well-known rebel. The afternoon of the morning of which this terrible experience took place, a large group of government troops came into the area. They found the Christian mother still bound where she had been left. Everybody else in the village had fled for their lives, and they had reason to. The government troops released the mother. Of course, they questioned her. Did you recognize so-and-so? Oh yes, beyond a question of a doubt. This was the man they were after. Which way did he go? Where do you think we might find him? They found him. They caught him. He was sent to the maximum security prison. Finally, this Christian mother, who had had treatment which I hope none of us ever have to have, heard that he had been captured, that the government troops had placed him. He had been condemned to death, and in the meantime, he was placed in this maximum security prison. It wasn't too far from where this Christian mother lived. Can you imagine this Christian mother walked the distance, approximately 50 kilometers, pled with the keeper of the prison to let her see this man? She did not identify herself at first. It was only later on that they realized who she was. She was given permission. She was shown into the cell where this man, the last time she had seen him, you know what he was doing. The man recognized her, and even though behind steel bars he trembled, he feared, she walked up to him with one of the jail guards beside her, extended her hand through the bar, and said, "My brother, I've come to tell you that I love you." Is that possible? That Christian lady worked with that man, condemned to death because of that terrible atrocity. And her Christian influence and the power of the Holy Spirit, which is tremendous. That butcher was converted by the woman to whom he had done such a terrible evil. He still had to face his sentence. But it was very remarkable that the head of that National Prison Services was told about the change in this man's life. He was told how it was brought about. He was shaken, like any of us would be, surprised beyond measure. Is that possible? How could it be possible? He went to this Christian mother and talked to her. She said, "Your Honor, it's very easy to forgive a man when you realize how much Jesus has forgiven in you." Isn't that wonderful? A woman to be able to do a thing like that. After the national head of all prisons had talked to this woman and heard her testimony, He was so impressed. He said, "What request do you have, lady? What could I do for you? I've never talked to a woman like you before." "Please, Your Honor, please let that man out of prison, and if possible, set him free. Is it possible? Please, please." "No, that is impossible. Impossible. He must go through with his sentence." "Well then, Your Honor, will you please release him long enough so that our pastor can baptize him?" "That I will do." This man down on death row, with about 3 weeks to go until the time set for his execution, was not only released from that prison, but was allowed to walk without a guard, only the pastor and a few witnesses, including this dear Christian woman, to walk a distance of nearly 2 kilometers to the nearest stream, unguarded, totally. And he was baptized. He walked back and walked into his death cell. Why? Oh yes, because of that wonderful love that had so molded and fashioned the heart of this dear woman. Because of her forgiving spirit. What measure of forgiveness. And as she put it, it's so easy when I realize how much Jesus has forgiven in me. Colossians, the 3rd chapter, verse 13. "Forbearing one another, and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye." You know, dear young friends, there are certain rules, certain do's and certain don'ts. Now I know young people, I know how I used to bristle when those don'ts were listed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's just an automatic nature in a young person. Okay, the don'ts become your do's and the do's become your don'ts. So easy to reverse the whole process. And it happens so often. Unfortunately, but yes, I used to reverse the order until I realized how much Jesus had done for me. And then it became so easy. Not because I must keep the commandments in order to go to heaven. No! "If ye love me, keep my commandments." And then it's so easy. A dear father, a dear mother, who has done so much for you, it's not hard really to do what they ask you to do, is it? Kabemba was one of these young men who had reversed the do's and the don'ts. He was rather a difficult young man. I spent the weekend in his village. We had a nice camp meeting in his area. Instead of coming to church on Sabbath, which the pastor had told him to do, no, he was going to do something else. Why waste my time in that old stuffy church? Those preachers just bore me. His father had asked him to accompany him on a little trip to go and visit some relatives in a village about 12 kilometers away. I looked for Kabemba because I had a little special interest in Kabemba. I looked for him during the Sabbath meetings, Sabbath school, church, afternoon meetings, evening meetings, sundown vespers. No Kabemba. He wasn't around. As we were closing the last meeting of the day, the meeting was disturbed, because down in that village, about 200 or 300 yards away, right down at the bottom of the village, there was a wailing, a weeping. A wail and a weeping that any of you that have been in that part of Africa know and recognize immediately. The death wail. A certain moaning, hard to describe again, only used for the occasion when death is either very close or has just taken place. This moaning started out first 1, 2, 3 women, and then it really swelled into a tremendous crescendo, right to the climax of that howling. Our meeting was broken up. It was right at the end anyway. Sabbath had been closed. We walked down to the end of the village. It was primarily the women that were weeping and wailing, giving that shuddering, that a type of a wail that really you don't like to be around. I walked up to one of the men standing nearby whom I recognized. I asked him what had happened, who had just died. He told me very briefly. He said, Kabemba has just crawled in from the jungle. He has been chewed up badly by a lion. His father has been killed by that lion. May I see Kabemba, please? I requested. Yes, permission was granted. It took 1 or 2 minutes until my eyes became adjusted to the darkness in that hut. No windows, a little smoldering fire in the middle of the floor. The smoke choked me as I walked in. The lower you get under those circumstances, the closer to the floor, the less dense the smoke, of course. And when my eyes became adjusted, I got down on my knees, and there on a little bed that was Kabemba's bed, just a few mats on a low slung pole, crude bed, was this young man lying. As I say, I got as low as I could to speak with him and then to get away from the smoke. I called his name. He answered, "Yes, Pastor." I said, tell me please, what happened?" As my eyes cleared even further, he was lying on his left side. I noticed he had no right ear. The right ear had been ripped off by this lion. I said, "What happened?" He was moaning, and in between his moans, I said, "Tell me, please. I have a little medicine in my first aid kit. I'll be glad to go and get it and help you." He wasn't bleeding profusely. It was just a gentle oozing from the wounds. The lion had grabbed him or made a swat at him, had clawed him at the side of the face, and those huge claw marks had extended through his neck, over his shoulders, and down onto his ribs and hip, thigh. Some gashes were very deep. But it was just that one initial swat. I said, "Tell me, what happened, Kabemba?" Trembling and in between the moans, he said, "My father and I were coming back. I was in front. According to African custom, the older you are, the farther back in the row you stay. The younger you are, the more up front you go. I was in front. My father was a little ways behind me. As we were coming through that dense jungle up there was a growl, a challenging growl. He said this lion sprang out on me, charged right onto me, gave me this clout, knocked me down, and stood there growling, looking at my father with his hot breath blowing in my face. And as I looked up at him, I knew I was finished. My face was sore. I didn't know what had happened. My shoulder was sore. I could feel blood running down into my clothes. But there this lion was just above me. My father was coming. I called, "Father, Father, help me, please. Help me." Knowing that by so doing, if my father were willing to help me, he would be pronouncing his own death sentence. But my father came. And as that lion was growling over me, and I knew that I was the one, I must be killed, my father came with that little hatchet that all of those people in that area carry, a little axe stuck into his belt. He had jerked out that little hatchet. He walked up there fearlessly, grabbed that lion by his mane and gave him a chop in the face. With that little hatchet, it was only enough to anger that already fierce beast. He lost interest in the boy. He killed the father. Well, that evening it was too late. It was getting dark then. There was nothing we could do about that. Up there, 1 or 2 kilometers up on the hill, we sent for the little first aid kit and tried to make Kabemba a little more comfortable. I finally found his ear caught in sort of a little jagged pocket down here on one side. It had been almost completely pulled off. Strangely enough, there was a little piece of skin that was still holding it here on his shoulder. The next morning at crack of dawn, with 8 or 10 men, we went up there, tracked the lion down, found the few remains of Kabemba's father, killed the lion, came back and paid more attention to Kabemba. He was in hospital for about 6 or 7 weeks. And during that period, I had the chance to really talk to Kabemba. He said, "You know, Pastor, it was while that lion was over me, I knew that I was finished. The lion was hungry, otherwise he would never have attacked me. I knew I was a dead boy. That hot, foul-smelling breath blowing in my eyes. It was then that I remembered what our pastor had told us, that Jesus really did love us, and that Jesus had come, and God had loved us so much that God had sent Jesus down here to face the lion on this earth, the devil. But when I realized that my Father was actually coming fearlessly, coming to save my life. Yes, my Father gave his life for me. Now I understand how much Jesus loved me. He gave his life for me. Oh, Pastor, I want you to go back to the village and tell my pastor how sorry I am. How sorry I am that I always do what he tells me not to do. Dear young friends, these rules, these regulations, these don'ts and do's, you know, they're all for our good. When you learn how to fly an airplane, your instructor will start out by teaching you a few basic rules. I know we have a few pilots in our group. You will understand exactly what I mean. You have to learn a few words. Thrust, lift, speed, drag. What do they mean? Those are some of the rules of aerodynamics. And you're purely stupid if you don't follow those rules when you get upstairs. But oh, when you comply with those rules, what a thrill it is to get away from earth. Up there among the eagles, up there in the clouds, up there nearer to God. Only a pilot will understand what I'm saying. But as you gain your cruising altitude, there are what we call your trim tabs. You have to trim out that aircraft. There's your nose trim tab, your ailerons, rudder. You trim out the airplane. In other words, you make that airplane just as closely as you can to comply with those rules of aerodynamics, those flying laws. And if you don't have your aircraft trimmed, it's a battle. Oh, you have to wrestle that old machine. You have to fight with it. And until you learn exactly how to trim your aircraft, it's no fun flying. Because that becomes a beast, a brute, and uncontrollable. You have not set those trim tabs so that it is in compliance. It does not follow those do's and those don'ts. And if you stay up there very long without following the do's, pretty soon it'll be don't for you. And so that's why we follow these rules of flying. And you notice the difference. You'll be holding that stick or that wheel there, and you really have to fight it, especially if there's any turbulence. It's a real battle if your airplane is not trimmed in compliance, in following those regulations. My life as a young teenager was not in trim. It was a battle. I fought with myself. I knew what was right. My dear father and mother were praying for me. I knew they loved me. But when Satan takes over, you will even cook a man and make his wife eat him. But oh, what a difference. Just a little touch, one or two notches here or there, adjusting your trim tabs. And that airplane will fly itself. No wrestling, no fighting to control it. You've set your trim tabs. You are in complete compliance. You have done what you're supposed to do to fly properly. So that airplane will fly itself. Just the slightest touch. And that's the sign of a pilot that knows what he's doing. He doesn't grab that stick like all student pilots do. They feel that they have to make this thing fly. No, it was built to fly. You were built to do what God wants you to do. And until you get into trim, your life will be a battle. You'll hate yourself. You'll hate your parents. You'll hate your teachers. Yes, and teachers will even hate the students if they're not in trim. But what a difference when Jesus takes over. And it becomes a pleasure to do the do's. You don't have to keep fighting. That airplane will glide through the air. Mine cruises at 175, 177 miles an hour without having to touch it. What a pleasure, what a thrill to fly when you're in trim, when everything you're supposed to do has been taken care of. Yes, dear young people, from personal experience, I know the difference. While flying up there and while getting ready to make that eternal flight. But it's so hard to tell young people. No, they've got to stumble through it themselves. Trial and error. This generation gap, unfortunately, does create problems. Oh, you're old-fashioned. You preachers, you admitted yourself yesterday that we have more temptations than you ever had. But how do you know what you're talking about? But dear friends, Jesus still loves us. And no matter what Satan brings into our lives, so many have told me on this campus, both ends of the campus, and even in between. But it's not much use to pray. Praying really doesn't mean much, because I just don't know what to say. There's nothing to talk about. Well, young man, do you find it tough to find something to talk about with your girlfriend? Oh, no. No, of course not. Young lady, do you find enough to talk with your boyfriend about? Of course. Why? Well, you love him. At least you think you do. What a difference when there's that love relationship. When you realize how much Jesus has done for me. How much he has forgiven me. Yes, it's so easy to forgive that roommate, that classmate, that teacher, that student. One of my favorite texts, I have many of them, Ephesians 4:32, is one my dad taught to me as far back as I can remember. Be ye kind, one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. Be ye kind, tender-hearted, not critical, not intolerant, but kind, tender-hearted, remembering how tender-hearted Jesus was for you. And then you have something to talk about when you get down on your knees. You tell him about that problem you had in the math classroom. You tell him how difficult it is to remember those dates in history. Oh, that biology, I just can't stick it. Oh, it was horrible. Some of those physics classes, some of the most boring I ever sat through. And naturally, I didn't get very much out of it. But you tell Jesus about that when you get down on your knees. Yes, I was asked, is it a sin to pray in bed? Of course it's not a sin to pray in bed. But if you really love him, you'll give him as much respect as you can. Whether it's in bed, whether it's on your knees, you have so much to talk to Jesus about because he has done so much for you. Then the do's are so easy to do, and the don'ts are so easy not to do. It's just that simple.